First, I want to give all thanks and honor and glory to God for choosing Elmore.
16 days after Nolan Wells disappeared on a boat trip to Horn Island, his family still doesn't know how their son died. 2 autopsies, still unfinished. A grand jury, still somewhere down the road. And today, none of that stopped, not even for an hour, so that a mother and father could bury their 18-year-old child. Hundreds packed into Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, dressed in black and blue at the family's request, the colors of Nolan's high school football team. Nearly his entire former team stood in that viewing line. Reverend Al Sharpton delivered the eulogy. Attorney Ben Crump stood beside the family and led the room in a chant that would define the day. And in the middle of all of it, a new $100,000 reward was announced. And a claim was made from the pulpit that, if true, could change the entire direction of this case. This is Nolan Wells' homegoing. Here's everything that happened and everything that was said. If you've been following this case, subscribe now, because today's service didn't just honor Nolan's life. It added new information to the investigation itself, and we're going to walk through every piece of it. For anyone just joining this story, Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old, a wide receiver from Ocean Springs, Mississippi, who disappeared during a 4th of July boat trip to Horn Island, a remote barrier island reachable only by boat. He was last seen around 3 p.m. that day. His body was recovered 2 days later. The coroner found no obvious signs of trauma at first look, but ordered a full state autopsy anyway, given the uncertain circumstances. Results, including official cause and manner of death, have still not been released, pending toxicology. The family, represented by civil rights attorney Ben Crump, commissioned a second, independent autopsy performed by forensic pathologist Dr. Roger Mitchell. Those results also had not been made public as of today. The family and the district attorney had previously agreed to analyze Nolan's phone, and Crump had separately requested that the phones of the friends who were with Nolan that day be examined too, a request still pending a response from the DA's office as of the last update. That's where the investigation stood heading into today. What the funeral added wasn't closure. It was new information delivered in front of hundreds of mourners and a national audience. It's worth remembering, too, how quickly this case escalated to this scale. 16 days ago, this was a missing persons report out of a small coastal Mississippi county. Today, it's a case with a national civil rights attorney, a nationally syndicated eulogist, a Hollywood filmmaker covering funeral costs, a former NFL quarterback funding an independent autopsy, and now a 6-figure reward. That trajectory tells you something important before we even get into today's specifics. This isn't a story that stayed local because officials wanted it that way. It grew because a family with no public profile before July 4th refused to accept silence as an answer, and because enough people outside Mississippi found that refusal compelling enough to get involved. Whatever conclusions this investigation eventually reaches, the scale of public attention on it now is itself part of the story. The family didn't call it a funeral. They called it a homegoing, and everything about today's service reflected that framing. Mourners were asked to wear black and blue in honor of Nolan's football team, and they did, filling pew after pew in those colors. Nearly the entire roster of his former high school team turned out, standing shoulder to shoulder in the viewing line alongside classmates, coaches, and family members who'd known Nolan his entire life. Nolan was remembered again and again, in strikingly similar language from people who barely knew each other. Gentle, kind, a calming presence, someone who made people feel seen. That repetition matters. When dozens of people who never coordinated with each other independently describe someone the exact same way, it tells you something true about who that person actually was, beyond any headline. The service opened with scripture readings, the 23rd Psalm, and a New Testament reading, led by clergy from Centerpoint Church, whose senior pastor, Ted Padgel, had opened the church's doors to host the service. A choir, Truth of God Elevation Worship, performed several hymns throughout the morning, including moments that had much of the sanctuary singing along and standing to their feet. We won't reproduce the lyrics here, but if you've ever sat in a black church homegoing service, you know exactly the kind of sound that filled that room: grief and praise, somehow, in the same breath. Before the eulogy began, ushers asked the congregation to silence their phones, a small, almost mundane request that stood in sharp contrast to how central phones, Nolan's, and others, have become to this entire case. There's something worth sitting with in the choice of colors alone. Asking mourners to wear a football team's colors instead of traditional funeral black is a specific kind of statement. It reframes the day, even briefly, away from a courtroom-adjacent tragedy and back toward who Nolan actually was before any of this happened. A teammate, a receiver, a kid whose identity was built on a practice field long before it became a national headline. Watching a church fill with royal blue and black instead of somber, uniform mourning clothes changes the emotional register of a service like this. It's grief, but it's also a kind of celebration his family insisted on, even in the middle of an unresolved investigation. The logistics of the day also reflected just how large this event had become. Centerpoint Church, a large congregation in Ocean Springs led by senior pastor Ted Padgel, opened its doors specifically to accommodate a service expected to draw a crowd well beyond a typical Sunday gathering. And it did. Overflow seating, a formal program with multiple named speakers, security coordinating a public figure guest list, and a broadcast quality production being live-streamed to a national audience are not things a small coastal community organizes for a routine funeral. Every detail of the day's structure, from the order of scripture readings to the choir's placement to the pacing between speakers, reflected a service built to hold both an intimate family goodbye and a much larger public moment at the same time. There's a specific tension worth naming in a service structured this way, and it's one the family and their team seemed acutely aware of throughout the day. A homegoing service, in its traditional form, exists to comfort the people who actually knew the person being buried, classmates who sat next to Nolan in class, coaches who ran drills with him, cousins who grew up down the street. Today's service also had to function as a national media moment, complete with a live stream, a program built around a nationally known eulogist, and remarks explicitly directed at an audience well beyond the sanctuary. Balancing those two purposes without letting one overwhelm the other is genuinely difficult, and it showed in small ways throughout the morning. Moments where the room shifted almost imperceptibly between grieving as a community and organizing as a movement, sometimes within the same few minutes of a single speaker's remarks. Image_search opportunity, Centerpoint. Before Sharpton spoke, before Crump spoke, the room heard from the two people whose loss none of this can actually touch. Nolan's mother, Christine, and his father, Elmore. Christine stood first and thanked God for the 18 years she had with her son. She described Nolan as someone with a gentle, calming spirit, someone who could lift a person's confidence with just a few words and make them feel like they belonged. She said if you'd ever met Nolan or called him a friend, you'd experienced a glimpse of something bigger through him. She talked about small, specific things, his corny jokes, his quiet nature, the way he made people around him feel comfortable. She shared that Nolan had once told her he wanted 3 daughters someday, and had already picked out their names. She asked everyone in that room to keep saying his name, to keep his memory alive not through sadness, but by trying, in some small way, to be like him, a light in dark moments, warmth for people who feel cold from the world. Elmore spoke after her, and his tribute leaned into memory, the specific, unglamorous details that only a parent holds on to. He remembered Nolan as a baby who crawled backward instead of forward. He remembered a very cheap plastic basketball hoop from Walmart, and the day Nolan tried out for a team, having never picked up a basketball before, and won a championship that same season. He talked about nicknaming Nolan Mr. Cool Hands, for how effortless he made catching touchdowns look, about taking him to the beach to run drills in the sand, about teaching him to study game film and read an opponent's tendencies. He talked about how Nolan became a mentor to his younger siblings without ever being asked to, and about teachers calling home not about trouble, but to say something kind Nolan had done for another student. He closed by telling the room that today wasn't just about how much Nolan meant to his family. It was proof of how much he'd meant to an entire community, and to people who never knew him at all before his name became national news. Neither parent mentioned the investigation directly in their remarks. That distinction mattered. This part of the service was theirs, and it stayed that way. It's worth pointing out how deliberately structured that choice was, especially given everything happening around this family. Christine and Elmore have spent 16 days fielding press conferences, legal meetings, and national media requests, moments where the investigation, by necessity, dominated everything they said publicly. Today, for a stretch of roughly 10 minutes, the roles reversed. The case disappeared from the conversation entirely, and what replaced it was the far more ordinary, far more devastating work of two parents describing their son as a person rather than as a case. A cheap plastic basketball hoop. A haircut only people who knew him would understand. Names picked out for daughters he never got to have. None of that will show up in an investigative report or a legal filing. And that's exactly why the family made sure it showed up here, in front of everyone who came to know Nolan only through headlines. For a channel built around covering unresolved cases, it's worth naming directly why moments like this matter to include, rather than skipping straight to the legal developments. Every name attached to a true crime case belonged to an actual person first, someone with corny jokes and a favorite haircut and dreams about a future that got taken from them. Losing sight of that, even in service of covering a case thoroughly, is its own kind of disservice to a person like Nolan. Reverend Al Sharpton delivered the eulogy, and it moved between two registers throughout: grief and a direct call for accountability. He opened by naming who had traveled to be there. Spike Lee had flown in from New York with him. NFL veteran Terrell Owens was present as well. Sharpton asked the congregation to turn and greet the person next to them, framing the size and reach of the crowd as proof of how far this story had traveled beyond Ocean Springs. He was careful, repeatedly, to frame the moment as one of both celebration and unresolved questions, explicitly saying the service itself was a worship service, not a rally, while making clear that the demand for a full and thorough investigation wasn't going away. He said plainly that no one in that room, on either side of the debate around this case, should prejudge what happened before all the evidence is in, and that the family didn't want anything sugar-coated in either direction. He said he'd received hate messages sent directly to the family's home accusing them and their legal team of stirring up trouble for money, and he responded by announcing a $50,000 reward, funded through the National Action Network, for information leading to an arrest and conviction in the case. Sharpton then used two personal stories to make a broader argument about why he believed a deeper look into the case's context mattered. He described a recent knee injury and surgery, explaining that his doctors needed his full medical history before they could safely treat him. "You can't set a course of treatment," he said, without understanding the fuller picture first. He drew a direct parallel to Mississippi's own history, arguing that examining a state's past doesn't mean assuming guilt in the present, but that ignoring history isn't objectivity either, it's avoidance. He also told a personal story from his childhood in Brooklyn about noticing that turning on a light in a dark kitchen made unwanted things scatter and disappear, using it as a metaphor for transparency itself. That visibility, not accusation, is what he was asking Mississippi to embrace. He closed his eulogy with a direct appeal to the congregation and to anyone watching to set aside the framing of black versus white and instead treat this as a shared demand for truth, noting explicitly that the crowd in the church that day included people of multiple races and generations, and that healing, in his words, has to be built together rather than assigned to one side. It's worth unpacking Sharpton's medical history analogy a bit further, because it's doing more work than it might seem at first. His argument wasn't that Mississippi's history proves anything specific happened to Nolan. He was explicit about that, saying directly that history doesn't equal guilt in the present. His point was narrower and, in a way, more careful than how it's likely being clipped and shared online. That an investigation which refuses to account for context, a state's documented history with how black victims' deaths have sometimes been investigated, isn't neutral just because it avoids the subject. In his framing, ignoring history isn't the same as being unbiased. It's its own kind of choice. Whether you find that argument persuasive or not, it's a meaningfully different claim than "this was definitely racially motivated," and conflating the two misrepresents what he actually said. His closing metaphor, about turning on a light and watching things scatter, was aimed squarely at the investigation itself, not at any individual. The message was about transparency as a process: full documentation, public information, phone records, footage from bystanders, everything brought into the open rather than resolved behind closed doors. It's a message that lines up directly with what Crump would ask for moments later. And it's worth noting that transparency, was the operative word throughout the entire eulogy, used far more often than any word implying a predetermined conclusion. It's also worth noting the tone shift Sharpton made a point of managing throughout his remarks, repeatedly stepping back from the more forceful, rally-style cadence he's known for, and explicitly reminding the room that this was a worship service first. That distinction isn't just a formality. It shaped how the more pointed parts of his eulogy landed, not as accusations shouted at an empty room, but as a demand for accountability delivered inside a service explicitly built around scripture, prayer, and honoring a specific young man's life. Whether or not you agree with every argument he made, the framing itself, grief and accountability held together, rather than one replacing the other, was clearly intentional. Image_search opportunity. Al Sharpton Eulogy, Mississippi Church. This is the part of today's service that deserves the most careful handling, because it's genuinely new information, and because it's exactly the kind of claim that can spiral into unverified conclusions online if it isn't framed correctly. During his eulogy, Sharpton stated that Nolan's phone and keys were not recovered until 2 days after his body was found, and he alleged that, when investigators or the family were finally able to access the phone, data had been erased from it. He also referenced what he described as inconsistent accounts from people close to the situation about the phone and keys before their location was disclosed, and he questioned, rhetorically, why an 18-year-old would hand over his phone to someone else in the first place. We want to be extremely precise here, because this is a serious claim. As of this recording, this allegation has been made publicly by the family's legal team and by Sharpton during a eulogy. It has not been independently confirmed by law enforcement, and no forensic report substantiating a claim of erased data has been made public. Deleted or missing data on a phone can result from many things: a factory reset, an app update, an expired storage cycle, deliberate deletion, or a technical error during data extraction, and determining which of those actually happened requires a forensic examination, not a public statement, however credible the source. If this claim is confirmed through the ongoing phone analysis process we covered in earlier coverage of this case, it would represent a significant development. If it isn't, or if there's an innocent explanation, that matters just as much. Until then, this stays exactly what it currently is: an unconfirmed but serious allegation from the family's legal team, made in a public setting, about a piece of evidence that was already central to this case before today. It's also worth noting how this allegation lands directly on top of a detail we've covered before: the ongoing effort to get a mutual phone analysis approved between Nolan's device and the phones of the friends who were with him. If today's claim is accurate, it raises the stakes of that analysis considerably. If law enforcement disputes it, that disagreement itself would likely become part of the public record soon. Let's walk through, plainly, what would actually need to happen for this allegation to move from stated in a eulogy to confirmed. A certified digital forensics examiner would need physical access to the device itself, using specialized extraction tools that can, in many cases, recover data even after deletion. Deleted files aren't always gone in the way people assume, particularly if the extraction happens relatively soon afterward. That examiner would then need to produce a report establishing not just that data is missing, but when it was removed, and ideally, how. Whether through a manual deletion, an automatic settings change, or something else. Only after that kind of forensic chain of custody is established would data was erased move from an allegation into a documented fact that could hold up in any legal proceeding, including a future grand jury presentation. None of that process has been publicly confirmed as complete. What we know, as of today, is that the claim has been made, publicly, by people directly representing the family's interests in a case where transparency and public pressure have already shaped how quickly information has moved. That doesn't make the claim untrue. It also doesn't make it confirmed. Both of those things can be said honestly at the same time, and we'd encourage anyone discussing this case elsewhere to hold that same line, rather than treating a eulogy statement as equivalent to a forensic finding. There's a reason this specific allegation is likely to dominate discussion of this case over the next several days, more than almost anything else revealed today. A delayed emergency response is a process failure, troubling, worth investigating, but explainable by human error, poor coordination, or simple bad luck on a chaotic holiday weekend. Inconsistent witness accounts are common in almost any case involving a group of scared teenagers piecing together a traumatic day after the fact. But an allegation of deliberately erased data on a device central to establishing what happened to Nolan in his final hours is a different category of claim entirely. It implies intent, not just delay or confusion. That's exactly why it needs to be handled with this much care rather than turned into a headline before it's been substantiated. If it turns out to be accurate, it changes the entire shape of this investigation. If it doesn't hold up under forensic review, treating it as settled fact today would do real damage, both to public trust in how this case gets covered, and potentially to any future legal proceeding that depends on a clean, credible public record. Attorney Ben Crump followed Sharpton, and his remarks did two things at once. They thanked an enormous list of supporters, and they made a direct, specific ask of anyone watching who might have evidence. Crump announced that filmmaker Tyler Perry, who had already covered the funeral costs, had reached out personally to say he wanted to match Sharpton's reward, adding another $50,000. Combined with the National Action Network's original pledge, that brought the total reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction to $100,000. Crump also publicly thanked Colin Kaepernick, who had funded the independent autopsy, describing him as someone who deserved respect rather than the criticism he's sometimes received. Crump introduced the full legal team working the case by name and used a phrase he returned to repeatedly: co-counselors. His argument was that anyone with real information, photos, video, Snapchat footage, anything from Horn Island on July 4th, should think of themselves as part of the effort to find the truth, not as a bystander. He was explicit that the legal team's position isn't that anyone is guilty. It's that the family deserves the same level of scrutiny and transparency any family would want if their own child had been the one who went out on that boat and didn't come back. He connected Nolan's case to a list of other names: Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Breonna Taylor, Botham Jean, Stephon Clark, Sonia Massey, cases where, in his framing, families had to fight publicly just to get a full investigation. He was careful to frame this as a pattern he's seen in his career, not as a declaration that Nolan's case will end the same way any of those did. The moment that closed his remarks became the defining image of the day. Crump asked the room to stand and led a chant, "Nolan's life matters," explaining that families like the Wells family often feel abandoned once the cameras and public attention eventually move on, and that the chant was meant as a promise that this community wouldn't let that happen. Hundreds of voices in that sanctuary repeated it together, more than a dozen times. It's worth explaining, for viewers unfamiliar with how Crump typically structures these public moments, why he leans so heavily on both financial pledges and collective, repeated chants at services like this one. The reward announcement serves a very practical purpose. It's a direct incentive aimed at anyone in the Horn Island crowd that day who may be sitting on relevant footage or information but hasn't come forward, whether out of fear, uncertainty about what they actually saw, or simple hesitation to get involved in a high-profile case. The chant serves a different, more symbolic purpose. It's designed to be clipped, shared, and repeated far beyond the walls of that church, keeping public attention on the case during the exact period, after a funeral, before any legal resolution, when families historically report feeling most abandoned by both media and law enforcement. The list of cases he referenced: Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Breonna Taylor, Botham Jean, Stephon Clark, Sonia Massey, spans more than a decade of cases that became national flashpoints for very different reasons and with very different legal outcomes. Some resulted in convictions, others didn't, and several remain contested to this day in how they're remembered. Crump's point in invoking them wasn't to claim Nolan's case is identical to any of them. It was narrower, that in each of those cases, sustained public attention from families and advocates played a documented role in whether an investigation got the scrutiny it deserved. Whether that pattern applies here is something only time, and the actual evidence, will determine. Part of what's made this case unusual is how far the circle of public support has extended beyond Ocean Springs, Mississippi. Tyler Perry covered the full cost of the funeral. Colin Kaepernick funded the independent autopsy. Media entrepreneur Byron Allen gave $100,000 to the family's GoFundMe, the single largest donation the fund has received. Comedian Lil Rel Howery and college quarterback Deuce Knight also contributed publicly. Spike Lee and Terrell Owens traveled to attend the service in person. None of these individuals had any personal connection to Nolan Wells before his story became national news. They were, in the truest sense, strangers moved enough by what happened to a teenager they never met to help carry his family through the worst weeks of their lives. That level of outside support says something worth naming directly. This case has clearly moved past being a regional Mississippi story. It's being watched, discussed, and financially supported by people across the country who have no stake in it beyond wanting to see it handled fairly. That's a lot of attention on an investigation that, as of today, still hasn't produced a single confirmed answer about how Nolan actually died. It's worth pausing on just how unusual this specific combination of support actually is. Families involved in high-profile cases sometimes receive one or two significant outside gestures: a GoFundMe boost, a public statement of solidarity. It's far less common to see a filmmaker cover funeral costs, a former NFL quarterback fund an independent forensic autopsy, and a media executive make the single largest individual donation to a family's fundraiser, all within the same 3-week window, all before any official cause of death has even been released. Byron Allen's $100,000 contribution in particular stands out financially. GoFundMe campaigns tied to cases like this one typically see median individual donations in the range of a few dozen dollars, which makes a single six-figure gift a meaningful outlier, both in what it provided the family practically and in the signal it sent about how seriously this case is being taken outside of Mississippi. There's also a quieter layer to this outpouring worth mentioning. Not everyone who contributed wanted public credit. Ben Crump referenced, without naming names, additional contributors who asked that their support stay private. That detail complicates any narrative that frames this outpouring purely as a public relations moment for well-known donors. Some of it, by design, was never meant to be seen at all. Let's close with where things actually stand, separated cleanly from everything that was said today in grief, in anger, or in hope. Confirmed, Nolan Wells was laid to rest today at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs. Both the state and independent autopsies remain unfinished. A $100,000 reward, $50,000 from the National Action Network and $50,000 matched by Tyler Perry, has been announced for information leading to an arrest and conviction. The family's legal team continues to push for a mutual phone analysis covering both Nolan's phone and the phones of the friends who were with him. Alleged, not yet confirmed, that Nolan's phone and keys weren't recovered until 2 days after his body was found. That data was erased from the phone. That accounts about the phone and keys were inconsistent before their location was disclosed. These are serious claims from the family's legal team and from Reverend Sharpton's eulogy, not findings from law enforcement or a completed forensic report. Still to come, results from both autopsies. A response from the district attorney's office on the phone analysis request. Toxicology results. Eventually, a grand jury process. Sharpton closed his portion of the day with a line that's likely to follow this case for as long as it stays unresolved, that until there are answers, until there's truth, they intend to keep ringing the justice bells for Nolan Wells. Whatever happens next in this investigation, today made clear that this case isn't fading from public attention anytime soon. It's worth being honest about the uncomfortable middle ground this case currently occupies, because it's the same middle ground so many high-profile, unresolved deaths sit in before they're resolved one way or another. On one side, you have a family and legal team making serious, specific allegations about a delayed emergency response, about inconsistent accounts, and now, about phone data, in a state with a documented history that gives those allegations weight beyond just this one case. On the other side, you have investigators who have publicly stated there's no evidence so far of foul play, and who've asked the public not to let online speculation get ahead of an investigation that, by its nature, moves more slowly and more quietly than a courtroom drama. Both of those positions can be sincerely held at the same time by people who all genuinely want the truth. That's uncomfortable because it doesn't give anyone, including us, including you watching this, a clean narrative to land on yet. But manufacturing a clean narrative before the evidence supports one isn't journalism, and it isn't justice either. It's just noise, and it tends to actively hurt the eventual pursuit of real answers by polluting the public record with assumptions that a jury, if this ever reaches one, would have to try to see past. What we can say with confidence is this. The pressure on Jackson County and Mississippi State investigators to move quickly, communicate clearly, and treat every piece of evidence, including 2 competing sets of phone records, with equal rigor has never been higher than it is right now, in the days immediately following this funeral. National attention has a way of fading fast once a story stops producing new developments. Today produced several. Whether that keeps this case moving toward real answers, or simply toward more headlines, is something only the next few weeks will show. If the erased data allegation gets confirmed or disputed, if the autopsy results finally drop, if the DA's office responds on the phone analysis, we will be back with an update, and we will keep doing exactly what we did today, separating what's been confirmed from what's been alleged, no matter how emotionally charged the setting it came from. If you want that update the second it happens, subscribe and turn on notifications. Hit the bell, not just the subscribe button. And if you were on Horn Island on July 4th, or you have any information relevant to this case, don't leave it in the comments. Send it directly to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office or the family's legal team, because that's the only place it can actually make a difference. Drop your thoughts below. Respectfully, there's a grieving family and community reading these comments.